Egon Schiele has become one of the most celebrated artists of the last 100 years, a controversial figure in his own short lifetime who was jailed on an obscenity charge. His work is starkly honest and provocative, intensely powerful images where the human figure is stripped down to bare essentials, both sexually and psychologically. He's one of the great draftsmen in art history, and perhaps the most obsessive painter of the self ever, whose influence has struck a neurotic as well as erotic chord throughout the 20th century. Egon Schiele only lived for 28 years and he worked for barely 10 of those, but his life and his art were dominated by the cultural centre that was Vienna. The fourth largest city in Europe, but far and away the most cosmopolitan one, a melting pot and a gateway where East met West. And also the laboratory of the modern world, where in cafes like this one, you might meet composers like Arnold Schoenberg, or philosophers like Ludwig Wittgenstein, or psychoanalysts like Sigmund Freud. But Vienna was a city of fundamental contradictions. It was the lavish centre of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, but that was a dying force. Its architecture, particularly the recently completed Ringstrasse, was effectively a sham full of fake Gothic and classicism. And then there was the hypocritical sexual underworld, riddled with prostitution, syphilis, and the usual double standards. And from all this, two themes seem to emerge as the dominant forces in Viennese culture, which find their most eloquent and powerful expression in the art of Egon Schiele. And those themes? Sex and death. But the story starts here, in the small town of Tulln, 20 miles west of Vienna, where Egon Schiele was born on the 12th of June, 1890. His father was the station master, and together with his three sisters, the family lived in a small apartment above the station itself. In spite of the lack of artistic tradition in the family, Schiele was something of a child prodigy. Not surprisingly, he enjoyed drawing trains that he saw at his father's station. His mother claimed that he'd begun to draw before he was 2 years old, and that he drew from morning to night. But in 1905, tragedy struck. Schiele's father had contracted syphilis well before the marriage and became increasingly prone to bouts of insanity, and eventually died when Schiele was just 15, leaving his mother to support the entire family and an uncle to become guardian to the children, all of which, not surprisingly, had a profound impact on Egon Schiele's developing personality. But the death of his father only seemed to make Schiele even more determined to succeed, despite the objections of his new guardian. Encouraged by his art teacher at school, Schiele applied to the prestigious Academy of Fine Arts in Vienna and was accepted. A few months earlier, the Academy had refused entry to another young hopeful, Adolf Hitler. At first, Schiele was happy to follow the curriculum that the Academy demanded. Copying casts, anatomy and perspective, the normal training for any young artist. But the most radical influence on his work came from outside the Academy. The Vienna Secession was an art movement set up in the 1890s that broke away from the official academies, which were regarded as too traditional. Within a few years of its founding, the secession built its own eye-catching headquarters in the heart of Vienna, an independent forum for artists, designers and architects. In 1907, Schiele met Gustav Klimt, the most prominent portrait painter in the city and the leader of the secession group. Klimt saw Schiele's talents and encouraged him in his work. He occasionally bought or exchanged a drawing, arranged for models to sit for Schiele, and introduced him to potential patrons. And the traces of the secession style and the influence of Klimt were soon to be found in some of Schiele's works dated from the time. This is a work by Klimt painted in 1901 called Water Sprites. And 6 years later, Schiele painted this work, also called Water Sprites. Although it's more angular than the Klimt, the influence isn't hard to discern. In 1908, Schiele produced this work that is both traditional and which also hints at a new artistic vision or voice trying to emerge. It takes the age-old subject of the mother and child, and in this case, the work is subtitled Madonna and Child, so it has a spiritual or holy dimension. But instead of presenting an image of nurturing motherhood, Schiele gives it a slightly sinister twist.
For a start, he presents the child straight in front of the mother, where the two forms almost look like an interlocking or abstract pattern. But the real contrast is in the faces. The child has an angelic, almost sickly sweet expression. But then look behind at the mother, with this sinister mask-like face, with her pupils barely visible. Now this is a chalk drawing, and Schiele's clearly experimenting. And he's also looking at and playing with a form of art that's very strong in Vienna at the time, called symbolism, where works have various signs and symbols that add up to something much larger. And people have looked at this work and said in particular, with the three visible hands and the triangle that they make and the triangular forms that each hand has, in some ways symbolises the Holy Trinity. Broadly though, I think he's using the idea of symbolism as something that mystifies and that creates a sense of enigma, and it's that characteristic that he draws out in the art over the next 3 years.
And it wasn't long before Klimt's impact began to diminish. The change is particularly evident in Schiele's self-portrait, painted in 1909, in which he emerges from his secession-style robe. It's a kind of chrysalis. It's as if Schiele's saying pictorially that he's now ready to step out of one style of painting and forward into another.
But in 1910, Schiele's self-portraiture takes a radical step, starting with this work called Seated Male Nude, where in fact all signs of furniture or background are removed, and a contorted figure that is clearly Schiele is projected against a white void that threatens both to overwhelm the figure, but at the same time emphasises something that's rather stark and almost brutal about the way that the figure's presented. He still uses that elegant curved line to depict the limbs of himself, but the work is becoming much more expressive. In fact, it's indicative of a style that we call expressionism, where feeling, personal feeling, and that sense of intensity looms large in the work. It's almost as if Schiele, as a 20-year-old, but still with the vision of an adolescent, is contemplating himself as adolescents do in the mirror and trying to make sense of himself. There's both a sense of pride and revulsion. There's a sense of display and exploration. And in fact, he becomes the subject and the object of his own work. But the pivot of the painting is a search for identity, in particular, sexual identity. And right above his genitals, there's this circle that's almost like a target or a mirror that draws the viewer's eyes in.